Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today, we're going to be chatting about figuring out faith after leaving a cult. I'm joined by Jennifer French, and this has been a bit of a long time coming. This live, it's been something we've been talking about doing for a little while, and it's something I wanted to do since I heard Jennifer's story. But before we get into everything, we just give you a brief overview. Jennifer's backstory and who she is. Jennifer is a mental health counselor serving clients across the US. She's also the host of the Project Hope podcast, designed to help families and friends with loved ones in a group of high control or high demand, also known as cults. She's currently getting a master's in psychology of coercive control. Jennifer herself was involved in a cult for 11 years called the Order of Christ Sophia. During that time, she disconnected from friends and family years. Today, we're going to be discussing getting your life back on track after leaving a cult and figuring out what you believe faith-wise. So welcome, Jennifer. Thank you for being here. Thank you for joining me today. I guess to just sort of jump into this straight off the bat, one of the things that a lot of times when you leave a cult, you come up against is how much the cult inserts itself in things which are so often so private, so personal, like faith and, belief in a god or gods and the supernatural and anything like that. And so it can be really hard when you leave a group to figure out what you believe. And that's my starting point today when we're talking about this. So we're not going to go over, anyone who's watched me speak to somebody who's been through something like this on the channel before. Normally, we kind of go through the whole story, everybody's story, and sort of do that sort of point by point. But Jennifer's told her whole story on her podcast. So what I'm going to do at the end of this live, I'm going to give Jennifer a chance to tell you all about her podcast and stuff. And if you want to hear Jennifer's full story, which I highly recommend, it's a heartbreaking story, but it's well worth a listen to get some insight into, the kind of thing that goes on in these groups if you are interested in hearing more about that. So lost my train of thought already, which is fantastic. But anyone who's watched this channel before knows exactly what to expect from me. That happens frequently. Towards the end of this live, I'm going to give Jennifer a chance to tell you a little bit more about that. What we're not going to do today is go through Jennifer's whole story. What we're going to do today is speak specifically about life after a cult, figuring out your life after a cult, and figuring out what you believe after a cult. Because one of the things, Jennifer, that struck me when I heard your story was that your faith was a big part of you leaving the group that you were involved in. And oftentimes I hear people that have left cults and stuff, and they become atheists, they become agnostics. And in a strange way, in a sort of unexamined way, I kind of assumed that would be what would happen for a lot of people. But when I heard your story, I realized, that's not going to be the case for everybody. So I was fascinated by that, and I wanted to hear more about that. So I'll ask you the first question in a second, but if anyone has any questions for Jennifer as we're going through this, please drop those in the chat, and we're going to go through those at the end and answer as many as we can. We're hoping to run for sort of an hour, maybe a little bit longer today. If it goes over, it goes over, but we'll try and keep it to an hour. So if there's anything you want to ask Jennifer, then go ahead and leave that in the chat. But for now, let's talk a little bit about recovering from a cult and getting your life back on track. So, Jennifer, during your recovery and getting your life back on track, what were the things that made a difference for you? What made it easier for you, do you feel? And were there any big sort of pivotal moments in that process? And if so, what were they?
Yeah. So, hi, everyone. Thanks for having me, Andy. I'm really happy to be here and happy to be with your audience. And thank you for getting your thought mainstream. So you've set things up easily for me so my nerves can be settled. So, I would say, so first of all, I guess what I'd like to say about imagining that I kind of had faith sort of throughout the whole process. Obviously, as I was preparing to speak with you, Andy, I was thinking about that a little more and kind of why and what that was for me. So one of the significant things, I believe, is that I felt like I had a relationship with God my whole life that was really mine. It was pretty private. I was raised in a Presbyterian church, but it didn't mean much to my family. I was kind of the one that was more into it than anyone else. So I definitely was seeking and in kind of a spiritual vibe early on. I mean, for example, in high school, my friends and I started experimenting with drugs, but it was very much about kind of the spiritual component, like exploring other realms and feeling connected as we were doing that. And so just to kind of set that as a foundation, that was sort of something that was important to me kind of from the beginning. So when I went into the Order of Christ Sophia, I was 23, I believe. And it was magnificent to me. It sort of put together all these things that I thought were traditional enough. So it was Christian based, but it was also mystical. So it actually felt more Eastern than it did like hardcore Christian. In some ways, I feel like we kind of ripped off of Christianity what the leaders thought was the cool stuff to rip off. And so actually from Catholicism, I mean, we were doing rituals also that were very Catholic. So, once I became a priest within this organization, I was serving communion every single morning, but that was also accompanied by a meditation time. So, and everything was very internal. It was very much about one's own connection with God and spirit. And so as we kind of transition out, it was interesting because I was thinking of even just where I'm at now, that I use the word God with certain people because they might relate to that. But really, when I was thinking about it, I was kind of going like, I don't know if I have the same faith. It's like I have the same core relationship that I've sort of always had with what I would call God. But I bet, like I was even thinking of you, Andy, and I was going, I know you identify as atheist, and I was thinking, I bet inside of ourselves, when it really comes down to it, we probably have a similar experience. It's sort of like, call it love, call it the universal vibe that's goodness and peace and love and people respecting one another. I mean, that's really, those are really the values that I hold. And I'm sort of like, I don't care what people want to call it God or call it spirit or whatever you want to call it. But it is something that I experience within myself and without, it's sort of that, it feels very fluid versus some thing or being that has rules that I have to abide by or fall into. Right. And that I can say is probably something that came post cult experience, because that very much, so when I left, which again, you guys can all hear that story. But when I left, my world was shaken. I mean, fundamentally turned upside down, everything I had known. Andy cut out a little when he mentioned this, so I don't know if you guys picked this up, but I was in there for 11 years. I was helping to lead the organization, and I was cut off from family and friends for 8 years. So when I got out, I didn't know if my parents would speak to me or my brother would speak to me again. I really felt like I was making a decision that I had to make because of my own relationship with God and my own integrity, and essentially like a discovery that the leaders of this group, who were supposed to be so elevated, very much treated like gurus, for those of you who have been in kind of more Eastern traditions. It was very much that type of relationship. And I knew that they were lying. And that was essentially how I got to that place of having to leave. But then it was so interesting to leave and have a fundamental, I mean, it really was a kind of existential crisis. It was like, what can I believe now? What was this that I just participated in? Even to the point, I actually had this little epiphany today, again, when I was sort of thinking about this interview, Andy, and I was realizing that 3 days after I left, and this isn't in my leaving story, but I had this experience where I got out, I was completely shaken, hadn't spoken to anyone other than my ex-husband at the time, who had been a part of this organization. And I went to a mall, Woodbury Common, for those of you who are familiar with New York State shopping. And I remembered today that I had this experience as I was walking, where all of a sudden I started to feel my body, and I felt it moving in a different way. And it was like my hips were swaying, like there was some sensuality back to my body. And it was a wild experience. I sort of realized that I had been living in this priest body that I was supposed to be in, wearing clerics with a collar and a cross. And it was this persona that I was in all the time, 24/7. And it was definitely a moment where I realized, oh, there's something core inside of me that I didn't just try to put on. This just happened. This is me. I'm a woman, and there's a sexuality to me. And I haven't known or felt this in 11 years. And also in that moment, another interesting thing happened where I felt this complete awareness of like my feet on the ground, the breeze in the trees, sort of like a parting of this other reality that was falling away. And I was kind of coming into this new presence. And so along the way, I felt like there were some gifts that were happening for me like that. But I felt very alone, very much in turmoil. And the big things that helped were connecting with people who had left already. So my ex-husband was a huge part of that process. And then some of those priest brothers and sisters who had left beforehand were also huge in that process. And then also, honestly, I had to come to a place of real reconciliation inside of myself. Like I had to actively kind of force myself to engage in reparations. So I entered into a massive process with my family where for about a year, it took about a year before I felt like I was in a space of connection and sort of love and freeness with them that I had been before the organization. And so when I was thinking about the timing and kind of my faith, I would say like that whole year, it was very much about reparations and me doing what I felt like I sort of had to do in my own integrity to get straight with what I had been through and what I had done to others. And throughout that time, I definitely, felt again that sort of love connection with God or spirit or what have you. And that was huge. But it felt like me, it felt like I need to get back in connection with my truth. Um, so yeah, so those are kind of the highlights, I think.
So I think there's I keep muting myself as you're talking, by the way, because there's like background noise, cars driving by, dogs barking and stuff. I don't want to interrupt, but yeah, I can really relate to a lot of that actually. One of the things I liked what you were saying there, and although yeah, you were saying about me being atheist, I would say that's softened lately to agnosticism personally.
Yeah.
But I can definitely relate to, and I think it's really important to make that distinction between some sort of external idea of God and an internal feeling or something like that. And I think when you have cults working the way they do, what tends to happen is there's an external idea which you then internalize, and that then, as you know, becomes part of your map of reality, your way of navigating your experiences and your internal experiences
Yeah.
also. Um, yeah. So just to comment quickly on what's going on in the chat. There's Nightbot, which is sending some of your links out there, Jennifer, and there's something with the last one, so I apologize for that. Again, if anyone's just coming in, if there's any questions you have for Jennifer, or is there anything you want us to cover more, anything that, drop those in the chat, and we'll come to those at the end. But yeah, there was something else that you were saying there. We said about the I think it's really about the locus of control in your life, coming back into yourself, figuring out what your values are, figuring out who you are as a person. I know that I've had that experience as well. But what you said there with regards to feeling more in your body, feeling different in your body, I can relate to that too, because it becomes so much a cage. The way that you live in your mind, it becomes a cage. And I know I'm somewhat prone to that as a person anyway. I tend to be very strict with myself, and I think so. I've seen that come in other ways, but I can definitely relate to that personally, and I hope that as anybody's listening to you here, that they do too, if they've been through something like that, because that moment where you, sorry, I've got a cat that needs to do one. Go over here, Tam. Yeah, I can really understand that when you say that about being more in your body, being more in yourself, and I think that is so important to really sit and think, what matters to me, what's most important to me, how do I want to live? And for me, the idea of faith as well, that ties into that so much, because it's not some, I think being involved in the atheist community a little bit, being involved in the skeptic community a little bit, I think the way that I had, although that's sort of worn off a little bit now, but the way that I had come to think about faith was that it was a concept of what's true and what's not. And while that is part of it for a lot of faithful people, I also realized that that's not the main talking point for a lot of people. Whether it's true or not, of course, matters, but it's, and I don't mean to condescend or be patronizing in saying this, because that's not my intention at all, but it's less about what's true and more about the life you want to live, more
Yeah.
about the person you want to be, and it becomes part of who you are. And I realized that more thinking about my more religious family as well. I've got family Jehovah's Witnesses who are
Yeah.
very on that. And I've had many conversations with them about, it being true and it being that. Main contentions with that organization anyway aren't what they believe. It's the way that the organization's run, and the, what I would say is an abuse of power. And that's not controversial, I don't think, unless you are a Jehovah's Witness. But yeah, I can, as I think I've made clear, very much relate to what you're saying there.
Yeah.
And so yeah, go on, sorry.
No, so I was just going to add to that because, you're right, Andy. I mean, I think the other like one of the more in-depth personal things that I can share is that in the organization that I was in, we practiced something that the leaders fostered as a process where we did inner guidance. So essentially the idea is that God is within you and you can go within and you can present a question and get all your own stuff out of the way and receive a clear answer. But truly, this was a setup because they're the ultimate wise ones and they have the final say on if your connection is clear or not. But with this principle, what was interesting for me is that it was the first time that I was truly connecting within in this effort. And so after 11 years, you're bound to have some profound experiences with that. And that's kind of how I describe this to anyone. It's sort of like anybody who's going to enter into a serious meditation practice for 11 years is going to have some spiritual or mystical experiences.
Sure.
So I connected to those as real, but there was something about the leaders being involved in that and also saying yay or nay to it or getting in there and shifting it in certain ways that as soon as I got out, I recognized that as a horrid violation. I mean, really, like I called it rape. It's like soul rape. And so for me, what was interesting was to then go, do I believe in that process? Or, I mean, again, do I really care if God, whatever God is to whomever, that God is within? I mean, I feel something that feels like me, that feels wise, that feels like I have this core that I know is a place where I can go that is my truth and it feels good. And that's kind of all I need to know. And so now I very much connect with that in a different way. I mean, I bet a lot of people would relate to it as kind of like intuition. It's something I really pay attention to. Frankly, I live a lot of my life off of that, and lots of decisions, even like work decisions that I make, are based off of that kind of intuitive space. So it's like, call it God, call it guidance, or call it intuition. But it is, you're right, Andy. I think the really important thing for anybody who's kind of, in this sort of recovery, is to really be exploring a new relationship with oneself and kind of sorting through all of these things and finding the amazing empowerment that comes with knowing yourself and making your own free decisions to navigate the world. So that said, what's also interesting that I came up because of this this interview where I was thinking about this in relation to faith. What's also interesting about part of this history of after I leave, and I don't know if we spoke about this, Andy, but it's pretty funny. So it is typical that there are statistics around this, that for people who get out of these types of groups and organizations, they often go into other ones that are destructive. And when I first heard that, I really didn't relate to it. And here's why. Because I was living in New York City. As you can imagine, I had all sorts of spirituality at my fingertips. And I missed community, even though I had a very, very tight-knit group of friends, but spiritual community. And so I visited a lot of different places and tried a lot of different things. During that time, I decided to dive into becoming a Kundalini yoga teacher and do the training for that. And I don't know if I shared this experience with you, Andy, but so as I explored these different places, like I went to some Buddhist temples, explored a bunch of different things. But what was interesting is that for sure I had kind of a radar, I think, for behind the scenes stuff, and also for where's the leader, who's in control of this place, and what's going down. So for example, when I showed up at the Kadampa Center in New York City, I really liked it. And I thought, oh, this is a place I can come on Sundays just to be on my own, chant away, get into the zone, and also be around others, and if I make some friends, great. And after being there for a few times, I started to realize, oh, there's a row of the same people who are in front almost all the time. These guys are students and they have a teacher. And there are rules. And there's a dynamic happening here that I'm starting to tune into that I don't like, because it had that little touch of that quality. So I stopped going. Then I get into my Kundalini yoga teacher training. And after month 3, they introduced us via video to Yogi Bhajan, who brought Kundalini yoga to the United States, and he's since passed, or he passed many years ago. But within our lifetime, I think it was probably, my guess would be like 20-ish years ago. So there are many of the older generation there who knew him when he came to the US and started with him. And actually, Gurmukh, who I was trained by at Golden Bridge Yoga in New York City, is one of his original students.
Okay.
And she is one of this old school crew that they were told to send their young children to India and put them in an Indian school. And I'm not sure if we talked about this, but basically in the beginning of 2020, a woman who had no idea how big Kundalini yoga had gotten in the US and abroad wrote a book about her experience with Yogi Bhajan, revealing that he had sex with her. He also impregnated her and had her get an abortion, and so on, so on, so on. Just like kind of atrocious guru story.
But unfortunately, never far away. When you get into these kinds of things, it's never far away, unfortunately. Yeah.
It isn't. It's so sad. So at the time, of course, so that has blown up the whole Kundalini yoga community, and people are very much in discussions around this. It's a big thing that's being explored right now, and has sent the whole community kind of in a major having to deal with things process. So what was interesting is that month 3 of this training, they showed us Yogi Bhajan on the screen teaching a class to his students. And right away, I almost felt sick to my stomach, because he, as a teacher, felt very similar energy to my teacher. And so I left the class, kind of laughed about it with a couple of my other friends in the class who I related to, and kind of said, whatever, I like the yoga, who cares, kind of thing. But then this whole thing blew up. And so in some ways, here I have been traveling through time thinking that I'm fairly immune to a negative spiritual commitment because of what I've experienced in this sort of radar that I have. And yet already I have had numerous encounters with groups that have these, dare I say, kind of abusive qualities. So it's very interesting. And as you know, Andy, one of my biggest little undercurrent agendas to my podcast, because it is for families and friends, is also that we collectively, you and me, Andy, and the others, that we are spreading the word that people who get involved in these things are not stupid, and they're not dumb, and there's all this goodness typically in the beginning, and then things sort of slowly shift over time, and you have so much good content about kind of how all of this happens. But it's such a heartbreak for me to have well, that was another part of my experiences. When I got out, I felt embarrassed, ashamed, stupid. And I think those feelings are so typical, which is why, like, if I were to actually give a recommendation, one of the things that I regret not doing upon leaving was speaking to somebody who's really educated about the field of these high control, high demand groups. And that's why, I mean, it was so cool for me to find that there are also people online which might feel a little more safe to individuals if they don't, I think when you get out of an organization, I also know for myself, my parents had books lined up for me that I could read. They were even willing to pay for specialized counseling, and I couldn't touch a book. I did not want to be with a cult specialist counselor. And that's partly because of what we were told about them in the group that I was in. So I was still kind of in that mentality. But I chose to see a counselor who was a regular, psychotherapist. And honestly, it didn't do much for me. And that's not to say, I mean, I'm a mental health counselor, so I'm not dissing on the field, but when you get somebody who really understands the specificity of all these dynamics, I mean, how complex it is, how, it really is a fundamental, existential crisis that one is going through, typically when you come out of these groups, that it's amazing to access these resources of people who have either gone through what you've gone through, who have written books about their own experience. There are incredible books out there about these dynamics and understanding them. And I know you have great resources on your site, Andy, for new people who are joining or haven't checked that out. Because those resources are also safe. You're by yourself doing that. But I think that to connect into that community is so amazing. And I didn't know what it was. And so I didn't do it. And I really wish I had, because I have to say, now that I'm super deep into all that content, I mean, I'm having new little realizations about myself and some of the dynamics that I went through that I had no idea were typical of this kind of scenario.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating as well. I've found, and by the way, just to quickly say, the resources you mentioned, Jennifer, if anyone is interested in those, they're always linked in every single video I make in the description. So you can check those out if you want to see them. But one of the things that I was struck by when I started to learn about how cults work and stuff is how similar they all are, despite how every leader and every group is like, we're the only one, we've got it, no one else has got it. And then you start to look at the way that these groups work and the dynamics between the leader and the followers, the kinds of things that happen, the thought terminating cliches, the little practices. You mentioned there's the inner guidance was the term you used, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that's very similar to how other groups work with these kinds of things. Everyone's got, there's a term Robert J. Lifton uses, sacred science. Everyone's got the sacred science as well. So they've all got these processes, these things that you do to grind yourself ever closer to the perfection that's always just out of reach, because you could never quite be perfection, because the leader's the only perfect one, right? And they're the one that's giving you all this information. So yeah, that really struck me as well. And it helps to know that whether you've come from the same group as the person that's writing it or not, there are those commonalities. And so whether you've come from that same group or not, you've been through something similar, and
Yeah.
I think that really helps. But also something that I've found as well is that when you come out of something like this, trust issues are also a real thing. Like
Mm.
it's hard to feel part of a community and relax and not worry that it's going to go that way again. I've found, I know that you were saying a lot of people tend to come out of one and go into another, and I can also relate to that. Although I didn't come out of one cult and go into another, I came out of one and found myself around lots of different ideas and different things, which I found myself becoming incrementally more zealous about. And I had to sort of check that at a point and step back and again reconnect with my own values, reconnect with my own integrity, which is something that is so important, because it takes so many people to make a world. And I think it's really important that we connect with ourselves and learn to do that in a way that we don't feel the need to proselytize. We don't feel the need to go out there and tell everybody or try to convince everybody to believe what we believe. I was reading a book recently by Eric Hoffer about mass movements. And one of the things he said in that, which I really liked, was that the opposite of the evangelizing Christian is not the evangelizing atheist. It is the atheist who doesn't really care that much. They're not really that bothered. They're just getting on with life and they're enjoying things. And I liked that. I related to that. It does feel like once you've come away from that need to proselytize, that need to have others feel or believe as you do, you are in some way liberated from, similarly, we talked about the cage, that pressure of acting a certain way, be leading by example and all this kind of stuff, which becomes very restrictive, I find. And of course, it's not to dunk on living by example or anything like that, but I think it can become quite restrictive. I've seen a few people who are leaving some things in the chat, which is amazing to see. Anybody else, if you have anything that you'd like to ask Jennifer, just want to say again, please drop that in the chat, and we'll come back to that at the end of our conversation, or towards the end of the live stream. So there's one thing that sorry, go ahead, Jennifer,
if I may, just off of what you just said, Andy. I mean, I think that's actually this is in alignment with what I was sort of trying to communicate about my own relationship with God. I think really where I have netted out is like, I would really just like to love and give to people in some meaningful way. And if that ends up being only my family and my niece and nephew, okay. If it's more people, if it's just my clients, if it's whatever way that looks is fine. But that's kind of my religion. It's like, let's explore and be together. And, when I say love others, what that really is like being in this world in a non-judgmental way, and really getting that we all fuck up, that we all have hells that we go through, that we're unified in this way. Let's share and discover together, like that is just so much more fulfilling and joyful to me than imagining that I have something that others don't, and and pour them.
Yeah, of course. I completely with you there. I've been listening to some stuff recently talking about like cancel culture and social justice activism and stuff. And I think that one thing that does lack in that perspective is something that you just highlighted there, that recognition that we all fuck up. We've all got things we've done that we're not proud of. And part of growing as people and the valued progressiveness of even the far left, to move forward. In order to move forward, we need to be able to, and this is a word I'm reclaiming from my Teal Swan days, integrate the challenges that we've been through, integrate the difficult things and the things we're not proud of, and come to terms, and like you were saying there, making amends. There's a lot in, I've not been through the 12 steps, but that's something that I've also been hearing a bit about the last few days, and there's a lot in that even if it's not something that I've heard people always agreeing with. I know James is there in the chat who's had some concerns with some of the 12-step stuff.
Yeah.
You know, there's some stuff in that I think is really valuable, really important. This recognition that it takes, first of all, as you say, we all fuck up, and second of all, it takes more than just sort of saying you want to do better, or leaving something behind personally in your life. That's part of it, but it's also about going out there and connecting with people. And as you say, and we coming back round to this cult conversation, going out there and reconnecting with those people who you'd lost in your life, and recognizing that we're all human, I think, is a big thing. And I might sort of, my train of thought escaped from me there a little bit. Apologies for
If
that.
I could
But
say something that's like slightly
go for it.
controversial, and this is personal, but you know, because you mentioned the AA thing, I'm glad you said that, because AA can be so helpful for many people. But having been through what I've been through, having done a bunch of research and knowing a bit about that culture and being in the mental health field, one of the things that I think is a disservice is to go to define oneself as an alcoholic. That's not all who you are. That seems like a weird message to me, that is who I am. No, we have many parts to ourselves, many different elements to ourselves. So maybe that's one part, but like that seems like a not so good mantra to say over and over again in the beginning of every single meeting. And I think kind of what we're talking about in terms of healing, Andy, is so much about an individual getting to truly decide for themselves their own choices and decisions and what that means for them. So if you are falling off the wagon and now because of the culture, you feel additional tremendous shame around that, again, it can be done a different way. The shame doesn't have to be put on top of that. One can go, oh, I made a boo-boo, not good. I want to make a different decision for myself that's in my control, and I will. And don't we live that way? I mean, don't we? That's what we're constantly doing all the time, is sort of making these healthy and unhealthy decisions and navigating that and making changes based on that. And so anyway, that might be a little controversial, and I don't mean at all to diss on AA, because it really, you know, there are definitely some people that really need to go, I am done and completely done, and the support can be amazing. And I think also it can get weird. It can get, it can be a very unhealthy pressure for people.
Yeah, I suppose as someone who has dealt with addiction, I think there's something for me that is really important about the ownership of that aspect of me. And and while I agree that it is perhaps for people at sometimes detrimental to define yourself as, for instance, an alcoholic, as such like a big overhanging sort of thing, I also see the other side of that, which I feel is very much the importance of owning that aspect of myself. If I don't admit to myself that I have trouble with addiction, then I may forget to factor it in my decision making. And and for me, it's not about shame. It is about, again, ownership. It's about saying, for me, this is part of how my brain works. This is part of who I am as a person. And if I again integrate that into who I am as a person, then I won't be limited by it, and I can find the ways that actually works for me. But again, I also realize in saying that the struggles that I've had as a consequence of my tendency towards addictive behavior, addictive tendencies, it doesn't come close to some of the things that I know people have been through. So I wouldn't want to speak too much on that, in the sense that I just don't know what it might be like for somebody who's been through that. And again, that's the thing with this channel anyway. I'm always very clear. I'm not an expert. I'm just sharing my point of view here, and please feel free to disagree. As long as we don't make it a pissing contest, we're all good, you know.
Yeah, and I agree, Andy. I mean, but see, you just expressed exactly what I'm talking about as
Right.
the healthy way, that it's
Right.
yours, that you claim it, you know, and that you sense inside of yourself that you need to own it to make good choices and embody your life in the way that you need to proceed in healthy ways. That's actually, you are the example of kind of what I'm talking about as an alternate.
Of course, yeah.
And
I think as well, I just,
of course.
yeah, I just seen Shade said here in the chat, the way we need to view addiction, the way we tend to view addiction needs a lot of work, and I absolutely agree with that. And I also saw that Marie said it's like a medical condition, and I agree with that too. You know, I think we can come back around to cults in a second because we have taken a tangent here, but you know, I think it is really important that we do see this in a way that factors into our conversation about mental health. I think mental health, and I think this is, to bring it back to cults, this is exactly the same with cults, with mass movements, with ideologically focused groups in general. This is something that we need to have a conversation about mental health alongside, because this is not just something that we can look at purely in terms of sort of mob mentality or the narcissism of the leader, which is so often the conversation we're having when I'm having conversations on this channel. The focus is much more on the ideas than it is on the leader. Although obviously, in order to have a conversation about a cult or an idea, you need to bring in, to contextualize. You need to have that conversation about the leadership too. But you know, that is such an important conversation, I think, and it's something that I'm not really qualified to discuss as much as I would love to really sit here and talk about the mental health implications. All I can say is, for me personally, I know that my own mental health struggles made it more likely that I was going to get involved in something like this. Sorry about that dog in the background, if you can hear that, by the way. But yeah, huge dog really going at today. But yeah, you know, mental health is a really important conversation when we're talking about cults and so on. So I suppose to bring that back, and you as a mental health counselor probably have a bit more insight on this than I do. At least from your personal experience, what do you feel mental health wise has helped you since leaving the cult? What is there for you that you've done, or that you're grateful you had, let's say, going through this?
Yeah. Well, like I said, I mean, just to acknowledge, I really wish that I had gone to a mental health counselor that really understood these dynamics. So that was something that was kind of missing for me. And I think because of that, I mean, honestly, I didn't get a lot out of actual counseling. In fact, I felt that because of the environment that I had come out of, that the two leaders of my group actually, although it was spiritual and Christian focused, they were both psychologists. So we had very much done a lot of psychological training, and you know, for those who were helping to lead the organization, and had a lot of those kind of skills to do communication work and things like that. And so, to be honest, because I had these relationships that with people who had gotten out of that organization, we really continue to this day have a quality of relationship where we're very honest with each other, and we talk about things that if we were to hear something that sounds off or unhealthy in the other, we would talk about it. So that was, I mean, honestly, the reason why I quit seeing the counselor that I was seeing was because I said to myself, I'm having deeper conversations with my friends who understand me more and are willing to kind of challenge me in ways that I want to be challenged, that the therapists aren't even doing with me.
Mm,
So this doesn't feel of that much value.
mm,
Um, so again, I think, for this particular situation, I would definitely see somebody who has some knowledge of
mm,
coercive control and these principles. Um, and then I would say also just mental health wise, it was really important for me to maintain the meditation practice that I had, kind of
mm,
that quiet, still time to really be with myself, to be with feelings or processing whatever was coming up. And again, that was super kind of in my control and
mm,
um, something that I was guiding that I think I needed at that time. Um, and I think I'm sure other people will kind of relate to me with that because I do think it's even depending on the messages that one gets in an organization like that, you may be more or less open to even acknowledging that you were in a cult.
mm,
So for example, my experience was in the beginning, I wasn't even sure what the hell I had been through. And pretty quickly, I started calling it a cult because to me, owning that, kind of like what you were speaking about,
mm,
owning it felt empowering.
mm.
And maybe it was a little bit of an FU to the leaders.
You got it.
But
You got to get it where you can get it, haven't you? At the end of the day, yeah.
it was like a little fight back.
Mm.
So
Okay, cool. So we're coming up to about an hour now. So I just want to once again invite anybody who's here. Yes, Gabrielle, this is a live broadcast this time. Yeah, this is a live stream. So if anybody has, oh, I've just put that on the screen by accident as well, which is a very good point from Marie.
yeah,
Meditation can
and
help you
just
get back in the
quickly
body. Crucial to
to
heal. Sure.
to comment on what Marie said about meditation too. I do want to comment here that meditation can be so amazing, and also honestly, for people with a lot of trauma, one
Mm,
can experience a process that's kind of re-traumatizing. So I do
mm,
just want to
of course,
put
yeah.
that out there that it is not a fix all.
Mm,
And if one is going there for solace and you find yourself getting panicky, that's the time to stop and
right. Yeah.
get some help with somebody who does trauma informed meditation or therapy.
Course, yeah. And I think that that really just sort of reinforces the point you were making before about being in touch with people who know this stuff, because it's one thing to read a book about meditation and go, I'm going to try that, or read a book about a certain kind of therapy and want to give it a go. But what you always have to do is take into account your history and, I having been involved in the Teal Swan thing, had that kind of latch onto my curiosity about psychology. And if I hadn't, since coming out of it, read so many books, spoken to so many people about this kind of stuff, there will be a lot more, and I'm not saying I've eradicated all of them, but there will be a lot more assumptions that had carried over from that experience into how I was now approaching the real consequences of having been involved in that group in the first place. So it would almost be a repetition of that same thing. So yeah, I absolutely agree with you, and I'm seeing people in the chat are agreeing with that as well. It's really important to find what works for you, to look for people who are educated on this. If you're reaching out to a therapist, therapy is a fantastic resource that's available to so many people. And if it's available, I've said this for a while now. I don't understand why someone, if well, I suppose there are many reasons not to be in therapy, but I'm already playing devil's advocate with myself. I haven't even said sentence yet, but I don't understand why, if you have the capacity to be in therapy and have access to a good therapist to help you, you wouldn't be doing that. I feel like it's something that so many of us will benefit from, even if we haven't been through something like this. But yeah, I feel like with all of this kind of stuff, yeah, someone who understands it, I think that's a really important point. But also, again, as you've mentioned a few times here, Jennifer, being involved in a group like this, it affects your ability to sort of this is, you haven't said this, but it's linking into a point you made. You're when you're involved in a group like this, the way that it inserts itself into your interfacing with reality, the way that it alters your relationships with the people, makes it very difficult after the fact to connect with people in many cases. Or it can. I'm not saying it does, it can. For a lot of people, I know that's been the case for me. So having access to resources, and this is where it comes back to something you were saying there, Jennifer, about it being something that's in your control. The locus of control has been returned to you, as it should have always been there. So you can seek out resources like books, like channels like this that I hope, in some sense, before, my intention really isn't to sit here and help as much as it is to create resources for people who are interested in this and who have been through something similar, who are where I was before. So
but also,
coming,
and honestly, I want to interject right here that you provide a space where people don't feel so alone. And I think that's huge. It's so alienating and so bizarre to have this kind of experience. It's so fundamental and core, upsetting in this very core way, that also I think that's one of the huge, you have great information on this channel, but also that people don't feel so alone. I think of, if I didn't have the friends that I had who had left at the time that I left, which actually some of the people in the organization left many years beforehand. And when I reconnected with them, their stories are devastating because they went through the whole thing alone. They lost a wife and kids and couldn't get them out and couldn't, these are very typical experiences that people have, where they leave and they know that they're leaving their entire family if they choose to do that. And then they leave and they're by themselves. And of course, things change over time and so on and so forth. But I love that there are now kind of communities online like yours, where if one is kind of alone in the experience, that they get to engage in that community.
Of course, yeah, and I'm glad you say that, and I'm glad that you think that about it, because that's a wonderful thing to have someone think about what you're doing. But there's, I think something I always say, really, I know a lot of people who are sort of more atheist, sort of agnostic leaning, are very much, this belief is wrong and bad and all that kind of stuff. But I'm very much a, live and let live kind of person. Believe what you like, as long as you're not hurting anybody. And that is the conversation, isn't it? Really, is it hurting anybody? Is it hurting you? And really, that's what this is all comes down to. I've seen a lot of people have been saying some stuff in the chat here. So what I'd like to do is say something about something that I've seen Margie has said here, and then I'd like to ask you one more question, and then we can come back round to do the Q&A portion of this live stream, if that's all right with you, Jennifer.
Great.
And yeah, so if anybody has any questions you want to drop in the chat last minute, as Mark's been saying there, it's helpful if you at me in the comments so that I know to look out for those ones in particular. But I just want to quickly say something here that on something that Margie said. We really need an efficient and effective, up-to-date database of reliable professionals with experience and expertise in deprogramming and cult exiting as a website nationally and internationally. Now, I don't know if something like that does exist, but I absolutely agree that it should. Now, I don't really know how to go about doing that, but I would love to see that happen if anybody is capable of doing that, or if it's a collaborative effort.
The best resource for that is ICSA, which is the International Cultic Studies Association. And we do have those resources.
Fantastic, fantastic. So hopefully, maybe after we finish, if you know of a link to that, Jennifer, or perhaps search for it, if we could get that into the description of this video,
Mm-hmm.
and I think I'll add that to my cult resources as well.
Yeah.
Thanks for mentioning that because I had no idea. So that's brilliant. Yeah, let's just talk about one more thing. I want to ask you here, really, about your what you would recommend for people, and then just so everybody knows what's happening, I'm going to ask you a question. Then I'm going to say to you, Jennifer, if you'd like to share a bit more about your podcast and what you're working on, because I'd love people to hear about that, and then we can get onto the Q&A. But just quickly first, what would you recommend, Jennifer, as for somebody who is just turning away from their cult, from the group that they're involved in? They've realized it's not good for them. They've realized this thing's bad, and they've started to come away. Let's say they're not involved anymore, but they're sitting there going, just been through hell and I don't really know what to do. I don't know where to go first. Is there anything you would recommend that they consider?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've kind of addressed this, so I don't mean to be a broken record, but I really do think that a mental health professional who knows about this field.
Yeah.
The book resources are great because you can be with them on your own and kind of take your time to process that. If you have others who have been in the group and are out that you feel comfortable connecting with, I think that support system is really nice. And then even to, it may be a process, but the process of reconnecting with others who weren't a part of that, be gentle with yourself around that. But I think also that kind of reintegration is important, and an openness around that, an openness to own what you've been through or what you need to kind of repair with others. And really opening also to the people that care about you, to just get loved up if you have people in your life who love you and care about you.
Okay, and I didn't mean to repeat a question we've already done there, but I feel that what you've just done there, brilliant, summarize everything that we've already spoken about. So I'm great.
I was like,
so yeah, okay. So if you'd like to tell everyone that's watching really a little bit more about your podcast, I think that this is the ideal moment for it before we jump into the Q&A.
Great, yeah. So, well, I guess I will just share a little bit. So what actually happened for me was that when I left the organization that I was in, my parents had connected with a number of other families that had adult children in the same organization. About 6 months after I got out, my parents said to me, "Are you willing to talk to any of these people?" No pressure at all. I think they almost didn't want me to talk to anyone. It was sort of like, stay as far away from all that stuff as you possibly can. But for me, and I don't necessarily recommend this for everyone, but for me, the reparation that I needed to do with my family, and then also speaking with these parents primarily who were in such tremendous pain and torture, being cut off from their family member. In some ways, it was something that I had to do. I wanted to receive those stories. I wanted to hear the pain. I wanted to cry about it and feel it because it felt real. So that was part of the process for me. Some of those parents actually, for many years, I mean, now I've had relationships with them for as long as I've been out, which is almost 10 years. And they really, a few of them were starting to talk to me about engaging kind of in the cultic studies community, and will you speak at these conferences and so on and so forth. And again, in my own process, it just didn't feel totally right yet. And then I basically had this experience. I'm not sure if I shared this with you privately, Andy. I don't think I've shared this publicly, but so I had watched a movie called James, the Jim Foley story. And some of you might recognize that name. He was, and I apologize, a little trigger warning of violence. He was the incredible photojournalist who it was right at the beginning of the Obama presidency, and he was documenting what was going on in Syria, and it was right when like ISIL was coming out, and we were getting to understand and know about those groups. And he's the gentleman that was held captive for a long time and then beheaded on YouTube. So some of you may remember that event. So there's an incredible documentary about his life that I really recommend. I was very affected by it. And I woke up that night thinking about it. I woke up the next morning thinking about it. And I just went, what is happening for me? And I thought, is it him and who he was and what he did and this sort of incredible person that he was? And that landed, and I was like, that's not it. And then all of a sudden it hit me. And I realized it was the story of his family. So he was one of 5 siblings. And the story, the documentary, is very much their story. It's told a lot from their perspective. And I realized I was so deeply affected by it because it felt to me like what my parents went through. And it just hit me that I needed to do something kind of bigger in service of these families who have loved ones in these organizations, families and friends, but those who were kind of on the outskirts, because I realized what was happening for me is I sort of realized it's sort of an untold story. Like we don't tend to think about those people that much. And, often our stories around cults are about those who were in the cult or the cults themselves and the leaders and so on and so forth. But there's so much damage happening to anybody who loves people who get involved in these scenarios. And so that's the story of the birth of the podcast, basically, that I said, what can I do to kind of create a forum that can help? And so the Project Hope podcast is really for families and friends that have a loved one in a group of high demand, high control. I interview people who have written like personal memoirs, which are so amazing. There's some really incredible memoirs out there if you guys connect kind of more to that type of storytelling versus really intellectual or educational or psychological information. Also on the podcast, the intention is to just educate a little, like Andy does. And also to have some discussions around some of these topics. So at some point, I hope to get Andy back to do like a roundtable discussion where we're all kind of exploring these topics together. And again, it's sort of in this spirit, Andy, of let's collaborate and understand the variety of experiences. I mean, I know in the organization that I got out of, some of those people really don't even call it a cult or don't want to. When we talk about, did the leaders know what they were doing? Were they conscious of that? That's an interesting debate that we've had. When did it
and it's
turn?
an eternal question.
What's that?
And it's an eternal question because you could never quite know, can you, what's going on in their head? Yeah. So people can find your podcast in the description below.
Great. I think Andy just froze. If I'm still with you guys. that you can, yeah. And so the first 2 episodes are my story of how I got in and how I got out, and then Andy's actually next on the podcast. You froze for a little, so I took over.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Cheers for that. Yeah. So there's a link to that, and just with all of your social media links as well, Jennifer. So if anybody wants to connect with you, then they can do that there. Hopefully, I'm not freezing up too much. It looks like I might be. So we're going to jump into the Q&A portion of
Not sure if you guys can hear me. I think Andy's frozen.
Am I back? Am I here? Our internet just completely dropped out, but that thankfully is the fastest it's ever reconnected. I do not know what's going on here. Yeah, so we're going to jump into the Q&A portion in just a second, but I just want to say for anybody who's watching who is a patron of mine, I'm going to be over in the Patreon exclusive live stream after this live stream ends. So if you're a patron, you can grab the link for that in the Patreon only section of the Discord server or in the Patreon feed. So I'll see you over there after this live stream finishes. But for now, we'll round this one up with a bit of Q&A, answering questions that you've asked in the chat. So I've got one here from James, who has asked if you feel any resentment at all towards the Order of Christ Sophia still.
Yeah, great question. So it's interesting that you ask that, because I realized the one thing that actually came up for me this week, and it was because I was speaking to one of my besties who also was in this organization, I realized I haven't forgiven the leaders. And I say that, I know this concept of forgiveness is maybe not everybody's totally familiar with it, but it's sort of this principle that forgiveness is really for one's own healing and not about that what they did wasn't wrong or negative or just bad in certain ways, but rather that for myself, I realized I still have a little edge of anger toward them. And I realized that that's sort of something that is sort of my next thing to work on. But I don't have that much resentment. I would say probably the other lingering thing that has repeated over time. And again, I mean, everybody just has, the experience is so nuanced that one of the things that has had long-term repercussions for me was actually career, because I began as a home birth midwife, a certified professional midwife, when I was in that organization. And the teachers told me that I was too much in feminine energy and needed to get an MBA and basically quit my midwifery career that I had built and worked very hard at. And that had obviously long-term repercussions. I mean, I so gratefully feel like I'm back where I should be career-wise and working with people and mental health. And that is such a joy for me. I work with a particular modality of therapy that also is just lovely. It feels very much in alignment with kind of who I am and what my values are. And so in the end, it all turned out well, but that was something that took me a while because it was an ongoing, it had ongoing repercussions.
Understandable. I think when it comes to anger, and I know there's that saying about anger being a poison that you drink every day or something like that. But on the same token, I think as well, it has to be your own process, doesn't it? You have to take your time. You can't, like, forgiveness isn't even a must. I know there's a lot of especially with in Christian faith, there's quite the emphasis on that, isn't there? Forgiveness being, but
Yes,
I completely agree with what you're saying about it being for the individual rather than for the other person. But at the same time, I also feel quite strongly that no one has any obligation to forgive. You don't have to. It's just if that's where you're at, and if you're ready or if you want to, then that's
absolutely.
there. But it's not an inevitability.
No, thank you so much for clarifying that, Andy.
Mm,
That's again, in terms of everything we're talking about, it's so
mm,
important. It must come
mhm.
from the individual as a need.
Absolutely, yeah. I it's on that point again, isn't it, of the locus of control being in the individual. So there's another question here got from Marie. Marie has asked, were you and your ex together at the time? Was this something that was why you split up? Obviously, I realize that's probably a bit more of a personal question, so feel free to say as much or as little as you like.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to talk about that. Um, Again, you can hear a little bit more about that in my leaving story, but to get into some of the nitty gritty. But essentially, what happened was that he was the one, he actually saw some things that he felt were culty, and he addressed it with me. And that was the first break in the veil that happened. And that was the schism that was created that continued to open that veil to me, that allowed me to really leave. Between that experience when he first brought that up and my leaving, it was probably about 4 months that I was still in. And it was very clear within our organization that if somebody were to leave, especially like at the level that we were at, that, he was no longer pure because he had decided to leave, and there was no way that I could stay with him. So that initially was the impetus for the divorce. When I got out, which he was very much a part of that process, that was also something that I kind of had to loop around in my own mind. And just to kind of share the vulnerable piece of it, his rationale was everything of that we just went through has to die. And anything that was good will remain. And he really felt strongly that we needed to divorce. And so in some ways I was in such also our marriage was an arranged marriage within the organization. So in some ways we didn't fully choose one another. And I knew as soon as I got out that had we kind of been in the normal world together, I don't think we would have chosen each other as partners. And in some ways, interestingly enough, it provided me with a very unique experience. And so I speak about this sometimes in terms of like arranged marriages in other cultures. I learned how to choose to love someone. And that was actually pretty powerful. We had a very healthy relationship, like high level of processing and communicating. So there was never like niggly stuff between us. So it was a really positive relationship. But in the end, I mean, it really, I don't think I would have chosen him. I don't think he naturally would have chosen me. And so initially that was kind of hard to grasp. Like, how is this not about me? It's about leaving everything that was behind. Like that has to be about me in some way. But somehow we actually kind of processed through that pretty quickly. And I wonder if it was also because we very much stuck together as friends, that he was really a huge part of that healing process for me. And so he actually immediately, because he had gotten out 4 months before me, he was already on like the online dating thing, which to me was like, what is this world that I just entered into, And he met someone, and he actually ended up marrying this woman fairly quickly. And she and I became really good friends. And because she worked fairly close to where I lived, we ended up in kind of this scenario where we just hit it off as people. And So we formed our own friendship, and she would spend the night at my apartment sometimes and go to work the next morning. And so my mother always said to me, she just didn't get it. She was like, why are you friends with them and her?
I suppose that's the thing when you've gone through something like this. It very little is normal in certain spaces, in certain parts of your life. So it does sort of change the way you relate to people and change the way, I feel similarly in the sense that I'm very non-traditional anyway in terms of how I see things, and try to put as much of my own shit to the side. But I think that's wonderful though that you've got that relationship there with them. I think that's fantastic. And I know, seeing your Instagram, how important family and the relationships are for you. So I think that's worth a follow as well for anybody who wants to keep up with that. It's beautiful to see. So I've got another question here from Julie, who said, what are your thoughts on these dynamics in workplaces? And I have a comment on that quickly, which I would just say, it doesn't matter where you are, what groups you're in, kinds of people you're around necessarily all the time. Cult dynamics, ultimately, to reference something that Chris Shelton says quite often, is at their heart an abusive relationship. A cult is at its heart an abusive relationship. And so it doesn't really matter where you are. Any group can become destructive. It's just down to the relationships that sort of develop in and around that. So, and workplaces are no exception to that. I think a workplace may in some senses predispose itself to that if you do have someone in a position of leadership who does fit into the sort of profile of a cult leader in that way, because you already have that hierarchy, you already have that sort of thing about, we live in a democracy until you go to work, and then it's a totalitarian regime, right? Then it's a dictatorship. Yeah, is there anything you'd add to that, Jennifer? Anything you would say on that?
Yeah, Julie, that kind of exactly what Andy said, but it's interesting because there's actually some acknowledgement around some of those dynamics. For example, they say that what was happening with Enron and the corporate culture there is what made that entire, our whole system crumble. It was because there were lies and people were hiding, and that was embedded in the culture there. So yeah, that definitely, it exists in all different ways. And of course we see it in political groups, and, it's amazing how these dynamics span so far.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely with you there. So Sybil has said, it's a two-parter, so we've got two comments to read in here. Sybil has said, I'm interested in the concept of ideological cults, political, social ones rather than spiritual, being a place that ex-cult members may be drawn towards. And then they continue, what are some ways that people recognize cultish characteristics within non-spiritual ideological groups, organized or unorganized? Sort of relates to cancel culture. Now, just quickly to say, referencing Eric Hoffer's book on mass movements, again, something that he says in that is that these kinds of mass movements tend to be interchangeable, and they can also change in themselves, in their makeup, in their focus, almost seamlessly without losing traction as well. So I would say it's really about the individual's own needs, the individual's own psychology. Speaking for myself there as well, I can say that I feel that the needs that were for me fulfilled by being involved in Teal Tribe and following only online people like Muji at a point, there was something that did for me, that also when I left all of that and I started to be on Twitter more, and I started to see the social justice activism, very much felt like it, without me even realizing it, sort of fit into that same kind of self-righteousness, that same, I'm crossing a line here, aren't I? I have to keep my mouth shut. I realized that it fits into something for me personally, that idea of being right, having something that I'm certain about. And I think certainty is a huge part of it. But to actually respond to your question and to give Jennifer an opportunity to answer that as well, characteristics are, if you look more generally, I think if you zoom out of the specific application of what you see on the bite model, through the lens of spiritual or religious ideologies and sort of scale back a little bit and look at how that might apply more generally, you can very much see how that kind of a thing applies. Purity tests you see all the time, confessions, you see public confessions a lot of times. And something I was listening to the Conspirituality podcast the other day, and something that one of the guys on there said was that the confessional mode is the cult mode. And I think that's a really concise way of putting that across. If you're confessing, if you're turning things inward on yourself and you're looking for all the ways in which you are impure, that starts to lead into this conversation about the group itself being the bastion of purity, the bastion of what's right and good in the world. And when that happens, it can be very easy to dissolve yourself into the group, which provides in an interesting way. Lifton talks about how for Mao, and if I hadn't been demonetized on this already, speaking about Maoist China is a surefire way to do that. I've tested that. For Mao, this cultural revolution that he created, the thought reform that we see when we study that and we look over what that is, what that was, and kind of how it's continued now in the ways that it has, you see it very much being a way for Mao to avoid his own mortality, to continue something in himself that he couldn't continue because of the obvious limitations of being a human, right? But if the movement moved on, then he lives on in some way. And I think that you can sort of see that as well in the dissolving of an individual into a group mentality, a dissolving of an individual into mass movements. You see that a lot. Yeah, I probably should make a joke now to keep it consistent with the channel. I don't go that dry normally. I don't know what to say. Anyway, I'll let you, Jennifer, if you've got anything you'd like to add to that.
Yeah, no, that is so spot on, Andy. I was very focused. Okay, so I did have a couple of things that I was thinking of. Some of the things that I would be aware of is kind of dictatorial leadership. And also, if you're getting sucked in and your life is completely changing as a result, to really kind of be evaluating that. And if it's distancing you from others in the world, and that's where I think it's so important that we're having these discussions right now after everything that's gone down in the US and with the Capitol and so on and so forth, that we really need to be hearing one another and listening and collaborative. And I think things can get dangerous if we're not.
I realized I'd muted myself then. I was sitting here going, yeah, I totally agree. I think there was I remember being asked at one point about fostering community among atheists, and something I think sort of more broadly is we need to, as you say, we need to listen, we need to connect with each other beyond what we believe, beyond what we think the world should be, on a human level. I feel so strongly about that, about we need to connect with each other on the basis of what it means to exist on this planet as humans, because it's not easy. Life is hard. I remember this quote from Jack Cornfield, life is hard. How can we be anything but kind? And I know sometimes maybe what some people may conceive as unkind in some of the jokes that I make on this channel, but it is all in good taste, I hope, and all in good humor. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I think when it comes down to it, what I would hope for in terms of and this sort of feeds into, I think, the next question that Sybil's asked in the chat as well, which I'll pop up on screen and read in a second. When it comes to community, when it comes to being connected with others, I think it's really important that we have a well-rounded, thick-skinned enough to not be getting upset about everything that everybody else is saying, but a well-rounded and compassionate approach to being there for each other when we've been through something, but also when it comes to building something in the future as well, and create. And I don't often talk about this. I use Lloyd Evans' sort of a thing about, I'm here, I'm sort of a firefighter here. I'm saying your house is on fire, let me help you get out, but it's your job to build a new house, you know. But in terms of building communities and moving forward with this kind of thing, I really am very much very keen on, let's meet on the level of human. Let's live and let live if we can, and as long as no one's hurting anybody, I'm very much for that. And when it comes to people hurting everybody, let's have a good sense of humor about and be gentle and be kind when it comes to having those conversations.
And unfortunately, I mean, I do think it's important to acknowledge here that our entire country is set up and founded on authoritarian structures, which is an issue. But at least we're talking about it now.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but you know, Melinda Gates says that, and they run all these stats and have all these, you know, numbers that are worldwide. She says that we will, if you run all these stats, we will not see equality even between men and women for, I think she said, forgive me if this is an incorrect quote, I think she said 210 years.
Wow.
So even our children will not be living in a society where men and women are equal. We got work to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I honestly feel, and let's maybe try to stay off of the social justice cancel culture aspect too much, but I do feel that, you know, the way to go about doing that is to be kind, to be understanding, to listen. You don't win battles by shouting people down. You might make you feel better, but they're only going to agree with you to shut you up or to end the conversation at a point. You know, it's about trying to understand. It's about conversation. So I think this leads into Sybil's question here. For those dealing with loneliness and craving community, they may actually be consciously drawn towards cults.
Yeah.
How would you help someone going through that? Is there anything you'd say on that, Jennifer?
Yes. Yeah, and honestly, Sybil, I mean, that's kind of why I did spiritual seeking after the organization that I was a part of, because I had a great community, but they were all not in the same city that I was in. And I really wanted that, you know, community and to find my people. So I think the thing is, if you're going to kind of go into groups, to just have a real awareness around that. But again, I think the loneliness, I think that can really be helped with a really good mental health counselor who can also be connecting you into yourself and exploring all those things around what can be done to bring you joy and to do things that feel healthy and supportive. And that obviously is different for everyone, but we so need community. We so do. You know, we're communal creatures.
And that's one of the things I love about what you're doing with your podcast, really, is that focus on that. I was going to say focus on the family. That's a whole other thing. But this conversation about community is really important because, you know, one of the things that when I'm sort of on the rare occasion that I do give advice, and I do try to avoid it, that I do on this channel, one of the things I say is, if you know someone who is in a cult, try to maintain your relationship with them. That's I know it's hard because obviously cults make that very difficult, but the one thing that will help most, and I think this goes for what Sybil's asking here as well, about people who might be likely to end up in them. Maintain that relationship if you can, because loneliness, unfortunately, especially these days where the internet is such a big part of everybody's lives and social media is such a big part of everybody's lives, loneliness is rife, and social media doesn't help with that. It actually makes us more likely to be lonely, as far as I've seen with the studies that I've looked at there. It makes it harder. So if you're able to stay in touch with them to help someone going through that, I would say, and I'm again not an expert, so please think about this and do your own research and stuff like that, but try to stay in touch with them, try to stay connected with them, preserve and maintain your relationship as best as you can without compromising your own integrity and putting yourself at risk. And because of course you're important too, I've heard this with all the stuff I've been listening to the last few days. You are not disposable. No one is disposable here. It's really important for you to value yourself as well. But if you can, and stay in touch with them and support them, what you might find is, without even saying the word cult, and I do say to people, don't go, it's a cult, that won't help. But try to maintain that relationship, and maybe with the word cult even being uttered, you may find that they are less likely to go towards those kinds of things. So I think this is another question from Sybil here, and we will have to round this up soon, so we'll try and get through all the questions before we end. But just a reminder, if you want to check out Jennifer's podcast or anything, there are links to that in the description, and I'll be in the Patreon only live stream after this in maybe 10 minutes or so, if we get through these questions in that time. Otherwise I'll be on there as soon as this ends. Going to go for a wee and then I'll be there. Sybil's asked, if we do leave a cult while still having faith or spirituality, how can we learn to trust ourselves and our beliefs again? I think that's a really important question. I'll let you start on that one, Jennifer.
Huge. I'm so glad you asked that, Sybil. It's crucial. It's critical. And so I'll tell you, one of the places where I would start as a resource that helps people, I mean, again, specific to these issues. There's a book by Dr. Marlene Weinell called Leaving the Fold. And it has a bit of a Christian focus, but really it very much applies to anybody, I would say, who is in anything that's remotely spiritual, culty. And she takes she has a workbook where you can actually go through a process around this. But again, if you're working with, a mental health professional that knows about this stuff, they very much can, because everybody's so different, but there are definitely processes that one can go through to start to understand kind of what you've been through and sift through those beliefs, what you currently believe that is completely and totally in support of you doing you. And obviously that's the process of the leaving and the discovery process. And it can be a big one, but that is an efficient way to do it, is to actually work with somebody who knows kind of what this process is. And that book and that workbook, Leaving the Fold, is designed specifically for that. I haven't seen one that kind of encompasses all culty type groups, but again, books can be very helpful with that.
Yeah, I if you could send me a link to that when we finish here, Jennifer, I'll include that in the description for anybody. If you come back in a few hours, it'll be there in the description, because I'll have to jump over to the Patreon thing after. But I feel like with this, for me, this is an interesting one, because I did leave with my faith, and then that gradually unraveled, that gradually changed. Am I still here? Can you still hear me all right?
Mm-hmm.
Is this breaking up at all? Okay, cool. Let's just check in. But yeah, I mean, I did leave with my faith, and then I lost that eventually, and ended up atheist agnostic. But as I said,
a lot of people do, by the way. I mean, just to kind of, because I don't feel like I've actually said that during this talk where we are talking about faith. There actually is, in this process of returning to kind of oneself. Again, Dr. Marlene Weinell talks about these kind of 5 phases of healing. And one is actually that she has found, in working with many, many people, that almost everyone has to go through a phase where they reject what they knew. And so they might reject people in the community. They might reject the entire religion or whatever it is. But essentially, that's a healthy step in reestablishing what your own beliefs are. It's a part of it's one of 5 elements to the process.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important. It's really important as well to say there that we aren't all going to arrive at that same conclusion, and I think that that's something that I said, I think in a previous live stream I did, what was I going to say there? Oh yeah, that was it. In the last year with lockdown and everything, I've had some experiences that I would probably be sitting here telling you I was a polytheist now if I let myself, but I won't, because I for me it's about skepticism and critical thinking in the way that I apply that, and the way that I apply that brings me to a conclusion wherein I would say I'm agnostic despite the experiences I've had. And I think that that's something that is deeply personal, and it's something as you say there, Jennifer, it's something that you might need some help with, but you'll figure it out in the end. And I think trust in yourself is something, as you learn more about what you're going to be like when you're not involved in this kind of thing, by setting out to do things, try things out, experience things, but be aware of how cults work, and so you don't get sucked back into another one. I think we've got the last question here from Gabrielle, and then we'll round it up. Sorry that this is a little bit, Jennifer, here. We've talked about so much. I don't mean to keep you past.
No.
Here. But so I'm not sure what GAD means. Are you familiar with that, Jennifer? Do you know what GAD symptoms relates to?
Does one?
If I'll ask Gabrielle if you can clarify that in the chat for us, if you're still here with us. But if we can maybe answer that in a way that doesn't necessarily touch on the GAD thing until after, specifically after coming out of general anxiety. Okay, yeah, generalized anxiety disorder.
Oh, okay, yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, no, great question. So again, to get somebody to work with, because like trauma, which trauma and anxiety tend to go very closely together. It's so specific to the individual that you really can't just do a prescriptive thing. So I really would recommend working with someone. Again, it's like we were talking about with meditation, that could work for some people. Other people, it could trigger, more anxiety. So it really is specific, I would say.
Okay, I think something to add on there, if you're involved in something with the law of attraction or anything that focuses on the power of your mind and your thoughts, and you're someone who's prone to anxiety, I know I am, even though I didn't know that. I know what that meant. I know that I struggle with anxiety, and I can say that having had the whole law of attraction thing in my head, that hasn't helped. So I think a big part of it is to maybe sit down and think more pragmatically about what you know for sure, and what the what ifs are that anxiety is so known for. In my experience, that has helped. If I sit down and I go, right, what do I know for sure here? Do I know that my thoughts are controlling reality? No, I don't. I might believe that, I might think that, but I don't know that for sure. So it's sort of separating those things out has been really useful for me. It might be useful for some, might not be for others.
Yeah, nice, Andy. Yeah, because I think also with anxiety, obviously with anxiety, you really want to get to the root of why the anxiety is there. And that's the best way to heal it and address it. So that's the general direction. And there are many routes to get there.
And to sort of address this feeling lost and low aspect of that question as well, I feel like, again, that is a tricky one, because as you say there, Jennifer, speaking to a therapist, being involved with a therapist is worthwhile. But also at the same time, I mean, Margie's just said schedules, grounding, solid support system. Yeah, I think that's That's probably better than I could have said it. Very concise. Yeah, just create something that works. I know you say asking for a friend, so mention to your friend to create something that feels stable, feels like you know what to expect. I know anxiety is very much about anticipating things and trying to guard against what might happen. So yeah, that's my take on that anyway. But so sort of rounding this up now. To sort of end this off, I want to say a massive thank you, Jennifer, for taking the time to sit here and talk to me about this and to share your point of view with everybody here. Really grateful for that, and thank you for what you're doing as well. I know that this whole thing is something that is thankfully being talked about more now, but not something that many people had really been talking about before. So it's amazing to see what you're doing now, especially with that focus on the family aspect of this as well, because it's something that is often overlooked, I feel. So I'm glad you're doing that, and I'm grateful for that as someone who's been involved in something like this as well.
Thank you so much for having me, Andy, and thank you to this whole crew. There were such good questions, and so nice to have so many people here with us.
I'm going to hide that comment now because I realized I left it on the screen. But yeah, thank you everybody for being here. Thank you again, Jennifer. And just a quick reminder, if you're a patron, head over to the Discord or the Patreon feed to grab the link for the Patreon only hangout. What is it called? I'm using the wrong words now. Live stream that I'll be doing in a few minutes, which we do every month. Yeah, so you can grab those links there. And yeah, thanks for being here. Thanks for your support. We're actually almost at 5,000 subscribers. We'll probably be there by this time next month. So thank you all for your continued support on the channel. Yeah, and I'm going to end the live stream here. But as ever, I want to say thank you for being here. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the stream if you've enjoyed it. And please be kind and ask good questions. And I'll see you in the next one.